Thank you very much, Prof. I think there's a very interesting way in putting this whole idea about Islamic reformation. And the most important thing is that all reformers should basically be faithful with Islam. Yeah, that's the most important thing. That's a very important message that we have to take. Because, there have been a lot of allegations that, like reformers were trying to sway people from what is known as the true values of Islam to other modern values, secularism or pluralism. And the thing is that, it has a lot of baggage in itself, right? Like last night, Prof. Naim tried to differentiate between what is a secular state and what is secularism in itself. And I think it's a very important thing to do, right? For us to understand this matter is very, very important. And I think without further ado, I'd like to invite members of the floor to pose your questions to any of our panelists or even to Abu Urwa himself. Introduce yourself and make your question short and precise and straight to the point. I would like to take 3 questions first. Please.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to all the speakers. It's very interesting. My question is, there is among the traditionalists, you could say maybe the religious establishment who, oh yeah, sure. My name is Saqib Sheikh. I'm a lecturer in Sunway University. And my question is, what's the difference between this call for revivalism versus reform, right? Revivalists from the traditional schools tend to say that it's just that Muslims are not sticking to their basic Islamic principles, right? And because if we were, we would be as competitive as Western countries, or we wouldn't be lagging behind. So what's the difference between that approach and what the reformers are saying? I mean, because it sounds that many of the terms tend to be very similar, but the actual how would you say, the actual changes that you're in terms of conceptual level tend to be very different. So how would you distinguish between what the traditional revivalists tend to say and what would be a reformer? Right?
Thank you.
Assalamualaikum. My question is very simple. I'm a Jahiliyah, but the way I understand, between Mecca and Madinah, Madinah is later, and the Islamic state and all that materialized is in Madinah. So if I hear right just now, it is the, how come is the Mecca period can abrogate the Madinah pula? Pasal apa? Even law, my brother is dean of law. Presidents, no? The later one supersede the previous one. See, if I read right.
All right.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, sir. It's a Jahiliyah question.
No, it's a very important question because basically you are touching on a very important topic that is being presented by Prof. Naim, and I think his teacher, Ustaz Muhammad Taha, had written a very important book. It was being translated by Professor Naim into English as The Second Message of Islam. And I think your question touched on that particular issue, and I'm going to leave it to Prof. Naim to explain it. Yep. Can I get the 3rd question, please?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Adura from the International Islamic University, and I have a question regarding Sharia, because what I've learned from school is that Sharia, back then Sharia was different between places because there is a customary or uruf thing. So I just want to ask, like, how is that not prevailing at the moment now? Like, why is it like enforced by the central state instead of according to customary instead of according to customs? So that's it. Thank you.
If I may start with this, can you hear me? Let me stand. From what I understand, this question is about is I would approach it in terms of the global reality of a magnitude of change that has happened. That our societies as Muslims or as non-Muslims have been radically transformed by technology, by expansion of trade, economic development. There's so much going on. If I say that today Muslims are 1.8 billion, how many Muslims do you think that were around during the early Abbasi period or during the Umayyad period? I mean, a few hundred thousand. So when you see the magnitude of the demographic change and of the global change in economics, in structural relations, in defense, in all of that, I think that we need to re-examine. The point is that Urf and Sharia, or the role in Urf in Sharia, and whether Sharia was Urf or not, all of these questions were questions that Muslims debated. But they debated on a scale, at a level, which is far from sufficient today. Because whether we like it or not, for example, we trade with China, we trade with Brazil, and we need to have rules that regulate international trade. We have an international trade organization, and we have these international rules that regulate bills of lading and delivery of goods and judging quality of goods, that we cannot just simply go back to what we knew as urf of very simple, or rather I would say simplistic societies, which had very limited scope for these questions and what we need to have today. So for any of us to trade on a global scale of today, we have to re-examine and reconsider. So I'm not saying that urf was not a useful way. In fact, the rule among Muslim scholars was that every urf that was not inconsistent with Islamic principles is valid. That, in other words, the assumption was that urf is valid unless it contradicted Islamic principles. And that's why Islam spread so fast and was such a powerful tool and engine in incorporating so many traditions. And all of them are Muslim or Islamic traditions because they were not inconsistent with Islam. They were not a violation of any rules that Muslims accepted as Sharia. I think the question about Jahiliyyah and Mecca and Medina, again, there are certain terms which we find rather comforting because they evoke early era of Islam and Muslims, like a Jahiliyyah. Yes, of course, there was Jahiliyyah in Arabia until Islam came. And there is, as Sayyid Qutb would have it also understand, Jahiliyyah today that will end in an Islamic revival. But I think these terms are not precise. What we mean by Jahiliyyah today is not what the early Muslims understood Jahiliyyah as pre-Islamic to mean. And we should not feel guilty or bad about this. They are just simply similar to the point I was trying to make to the earlier question. We are just dealing with issues on a much different scale and complexity than it used to be in the past. And if we do not respond to today's challenges, we will be defeated by the modern Jahiliyyah. So we don't defeat it by simply calling it Jahiliyyah. We defeat it by transcending it and presenting a superior level of civilization than the Jahiliyyah level of civilization. On the question of revivalism versus reform, the question from our son, I should say, if you permit me, you are my son, is that as I understand it, revival is to revive something that already existed. Whereas reform may include revival and more. So revival is simply that if we just revive what Muslims did in the past, we will be fine. I disagree with that. I do not believe that it is enough to just simply revive what we already had. That we have to think of different levels of as I said, complexity, of global scope, of massive resources that need to be regulated and need to be justly distributed, and that is not going to be done by simply reviving what we used to have. I am a believer in reform, but it is a reform of our understanding of Islam, not of Islam itself. As I said earlier, I don't think that any human being can speak of Islam itself. Nobody has the authority to do so. But all of us have the need to speak of Islamic reform, reform of the way Muslims think and understand, not the way that Islam itself is established. Thank you.
Before I ask my question with a little bit of comment, I must add that I'm a medical doctor, and in our practice, when we revive a patient, the patient is almost like dead or moribund. So you revive something that is not functioning anymore. We try not to reform, we only revive. Okay, I look at the word reform and deform, reforming, deforming as very strong words. These are things that somebody has to do. And that somebody can be the public, the individuals, or it can be the state or the government. After what Prof. Naim described just now, what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen and in Libya and in Syria, would you agree with me to say that if you compare these two, the deforming of Islam or Islamic thoughts has been in many places more done by the state than by the people themselves? I'd like to bring our attention to a third player there. The people, the lay people, the government of the state. And this is very true of Malaysia at the moment. I do not know what is happening in Sudan or in Egypt. You may be able to enlighten me whether you see the same things in your country. The third player in Malaysia is what we call the alim ulama. Some are sanctioned by the state, some are self-styled, and they are mushrooming. And as you said, there is no one definition of Sharia, there is no one definition what Islam should be, and these multitudes of alim ulama in Malaysia, they seem to have very different minds as well. And what worries me is that each of them have a huge following. It's like a fan club. You know, this alim ulama will have this number of people, and they actually debate among themselves. Now, so my question is really what I've asked you earlier on, that do you see this in your country, and do you think this, to me, is a very negative trend? But they are there, you can get rid of them. Can you give any suggestion how we can make that into a positive trend? Because they are the ones that are reforming or deforming what you said, thoughts, or what you say, understanding. Yeah, we are not reforming the religion, we are reforming the Islamic thoughts. Otherwise, it will be like the Catholic Protestant break. That is a reform, that is really a breakup. So it is this very influential alim ulama that really will bring about a positive reformation, or they actually deform or in a negative way. So I don't know whether you can have an answer to my question. Do you have any suggestions of what to do with this negative trend that we are seeing? And do you have these trends in Sudan, in Egypt, or in Tunisia, or places like that?
Thank you. Assalamualaikum. My name is Irwan. I'm from the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Just would like to address the question to Dr. Abdullahi Naim. When you mentioned about that nobody should be claiming that they speak on behalf of Islam. Now, basically what we have is just our understanding. I just would like to get a further clarification from you. Isn't that certain things in Islam that, for example, the usul al-sharia, usul al-din, بعض الأشياء لا بد تكون معلوم بالضرورة. I mean, these things, the basic things, the basic tenets of the aqidah and stuff, shouldn't that when we say about it, then that is Islam itself? I mean, what I'm trying to ask is that in Islam, shouldn't there be like certain aspect or certain things that when we speak of, and we are surely that truly come from Islam? I mean, qat'i'u dilalah. I mean, like what our scholars have said in usul al-fiqh and stuff. And maybe Prof. Waleed can also, clarify further. When our scholars of Maqasid al-Sharia, for example, when they want to come with all these principles of adalah, dignity, justice that you have stated, I mean, these concepts are basically, I mean, they produce after they have done throughout analysis. I mean, manhaj istiqra'iyah, throughout all the verses, all the sources of Islam. I mean, they don't simply come with speculative or dhaniyah to dilalah. I mean, I found this to be very much similar in science. I mean, when we do experiments and when we observe that the same results that we obtain again and again, and then we're going to develop that hypothesis into theories. I mean, same things in economics and other disciplines. I mean, things that have been established and consistently. I mean, then people will claim that this is the theory. I mean, so it's just that my opinion is that shouldn't we also agree that there should be certain things, the basic thing, fundamentals in Islam, that when we speak of, then that thing is Islam itself. It's not just our view. I mean, other things like the furu' things and stuff, I mean, I could agree that these are, we can never claim that what I said is true. But I just that, I'm curious to know what is your view on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Prof, I was quite taken up by your presentation, and also I managed to buy the English copy and the Malay translation as well. And as usual, try to get the signature fast in case you were leaving the hall. I have one comment and one question. The comment is more because of my own tradition as a Christian, looking at the thoughts on revival and reform. In the Christian tradition, revival centers more on spirituality at the individual level for change. And I believe you cannot have one without the other, that without the inner spiritual transformation, you're not going to see the change in society. So the Reformation that came in the Christian tradition and with Luther, because there were so many references to Protestant Catholic here, that Reformation actually has a seed of spiritual change that resulted in societal change. And I'm sure within the Islamic tradition of change in society, there is also the inner spiritual person who is not just pietistic, but wants to see justice, as the professor highlighted. I think my question, because I've not read your book yet, but I tried to skim through. The lighting is a bit bad, so I couldn't read your section on human rights. We have a discourse among many people in this country that human rights is a bad word and Muslims should never come close to human rights, and that there is no such thing as universality of human rights, and the UDHR is something that must be rejected. I don't see that coming from both the speakers today in that kind of theme. I see, so it's a question about your comment on the UDHR. I can see two clauses that might have difficulty. One is on the religious freedom, the right to convert. And even if one compared it with the Cairo Declaration that says there can be no compulsion in Islam. But that's one point. And the popular thought here is against LGBT, and that all of human rights is sexual freedom or sexuality. And we also see that the movement that justified against human rights was against discrimination on the basis of race. And they felt it was a campaign from Islam that they should reject International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which in my own referring to the UN Geneva references, find that a majority of Muslim countries have actually ratified ICER. So I wanted not so much to comment on the politics here, but from the principle of Islam, is there intrinsically anything wrong with the conventions and documents and the Muslim participation at the global level for human rights? I hear the word justice. Is there justice in society? Is there fairness? But that's not what we are hearing here as non-Muslims in this country, except for some strong voices who are being suppressed by certain sections. Thank you very much.
I think that there are several questions. Yeah, there were several questions that were raised, and I hope that I will at least pick some threads from all of them in trying to form an answer. The question about the role of the ulama. Actually, in my view, again, in my view, there should be no role whatsoever to a class of scholars who call themselves ulama. That the original ulama of Islam were not people who set themselves apart or who were certified by some institution to be competent to do this or the other. They were men of the world. Abu Hanifa was a mercantile trader. Abu Hanifa, Al-Imam Abu Hanifa, was a merchant of textiles. And he kept his trade. And he refused to accept any position appointed by the state or to draw a salary from the state. So the true tradition that we should belong to is a tradition of people who lead normal lives, so-called everyday lives. But their learning, their piety, their respect of others earn them the position of leadership. Not because a state appointed them. By the way, being appointed by the state is an immediate disqualifier. Because the state does not appoint you to hold justice, but to serve its ends. Ulama ad-din, ulama ad-dawla. They are scholars of the state, they are not scholars of religion. So, I know I tend to speak more rather strongly, but the point for me, personally, I would not expect, I would not look for true pious guidance from people who make a living of being paid by the state for the views they present. I would say son. I find it difficult to say brother. You are my brother, but you are my son as well. My son is 43 years old. Are you that old? So the point is that when you said ما علم من الدين بالضرورة أو أصول الشريعة أصول الدين, when these terms come up, when did Muslims started talking about أصول الدين, أصول الشريعة, or ما علم من الدين بالضرورة? At least 700 to 800 years after the Prophet ﷺ. These so-called sciences of religion are utterly unknown to Muslims, unknown completely to Muslims of the first, of the second, of the third, of the fourth centuries of Islam. So what authority would you have for something that came so late and was so purely human? There was absolutely no issue of revelation or wahi or divine guidance 200, 300, 400 years after the Prophet ﷺ died. So I say you use these terminologies to hide the fact that this is nothing more than human endeavor. Human endeavor is good, and al-mujtahid should be rewarded, but not by dressing up our ijtihad as if it is divine truth. Ijtihad is not divine truth and should not be treated as such. So for me, and when I speak of Islam, I speak of Islam in its essence, at the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. Everything else is human endeavor. And therefore I refuse to call it Islam. And I don't see the reason why it should be called Islam other than to hide behind the term from critique of the conduct. So people who wish to raise the defense, Islam is, we are doing Islam, we are respecting Islam, so don't criticize me. No, I do, because you are not speaking Islam, you are speaking your view of Islam. It is never more than that. On the question of, and you went on to speak about these issues as if they are science. And you said that in the same way that, and in fact, actually, you said science and then economics. Economics is not a science. It is controversial. Why do they call them social sciences and not sciences? Is because there is a challenge to the claim of human sciences as physical sciences. These are controversies that Western civilizations and scholars debated for a long time. But the point for me is that when something is ultimately, it's a value judgment. So when I read the result of a chemical test, it is plain. Every human being will read the same result of a chemical test in the same way. But when I present a human argument, a social science argument, people will disagree, and they are entitled to disagree. In any case, we do not need to equate social sciences with physical sciences, unless we want to hide behind the label of science, so that we protect our own fallacies and mistakes. So we don't need to do that. Call it human, and there is nothing wrong with being human. After all, human is, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. Human is the object, is the purpose of all religion. And therefore, it's not a light question that human beings are really honored by God, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, but the point is that we should not confuse our categories in this way. About the question about, I will come to human rights in a minute, but also let me see if Christian and reform, Christianity or Christian discourse and reform. I have a position that we tend to think, because we share the same script, we accept the Bible, and we share and we revere all the prophets of Christianity and of Judaism. We tend to say Islam and Christianity, but they are different. And that is not to say one is better than the other, but they are not the same. And I give a very particular meaning of this point, that when religious doctrine is produced by an institution, a human institution, like the church or the papacy, the Vatican, the doctrine is produced by human institutions, but dressed up as divine or as infallible. The doctrine of the infallibility of the Pope. This is a doctrine that came about specifically at a time 1,000 years ago or so, when there was a lot of dissension and disagreements among Christians, and therefore the Pope came up with an idea of saying that the Pope is divine, is infallible. I don't care to judge what is right and wrong, but this is not the same as how Sharia evolved. Sharia evolved through human effort and never claimed divine authority. So the scholars, Abu Hanifa, Malik, al-Shafi'i, all the founders of the schools, they never claimed divine authority. They presented their arguments. You judge me right or wrong. And the point is that what we now accept as Sharia came about as a result of what I call over the intergenerational consensus. That is, when generation after generation after generation of Muslims accept a particular view, that becomes to them integral to Sharia. But if something that does not stand the test of time and the test of consensus among succeeding generations, then it is dangerous to call it Sharia, because it could be proven to be false again. So the point is that the manner in which Sharia is produced and the manner in which, for example, Christian doctrine was produced are different. And therefore we should not confuse the two. But this is not to say in the least that Christianity is less or more, or Islam is less or more. They are just different traditions and should be respected as such. About the question about universality of human rights and about the conduct of Muslim states, when you read the chapter, you will see that my position is exact opposite of what you assumed. My position is the exact opposite of what you assumed it is to be. And that's why I invite you to read the chapter and then to engage in discussing the point. I am 73 years old. Since I was 22 years of age, I have been a defender of human rights in Sudan from an Islamic point of view. Since I was a student in law school in Sudan, I was defending human rights from an Islamic point of view, not as a matter of secular or Western this and Western that. And ever since, I never stopped doing so. And you can look, just Google my name, and it will come to you scores of articles and book chapters defending human rights and the universality of human rights. But I am known for challenging taking Western liberalism as equivalent to universality of human rights. Liberalism is a particular doctrine, a philosophy, a point of view that is not universal. And we cannot accept it as such. For liberals who care to justify their commitment to human rights from a liberal point of view, well and good. Do so and let us see the outcome. I welcome true commitment out of that. But for me as a Muslim, to require me to either defend human rights from a liberal point of view or condemn me as failing to respect human rights, I refuse that. My position has been that every civilization, every culture is entitled to found and to defend human rights from its own perspective, from its own experience. So I don't need to go to a Western liberal idea, not because it is wrong, because it is Western, but it is imperial. Liberalism is imperial. Europe became imperial as an outcome of imperialism, of liberalism. And capitalism is imperial and is liberal. The term right in human rights is problematic from a human rights point of view because it is not universal. When the term right in liberal discourse is about rights which have to be justiciable. There have to be a positive right enacted by the state so that you can take it to court and have it enforced. So if you don't have a claim that the state courts can enforce, it is not worthy of being called a right. If that is the definition of rights, then the most significant aspect of human rights are lost. Economic and social rights, the right to health care, the right to education, the right to protection of the environment, the right to peace, the right to development. All of these claims people are making, which are not rights which you can take to a court of law to enforce, but they are entitlements. They are fundamental entitlements. So a liberal mind is incapable of accepting the human rights quality of a right to education. So a right to free expression is a human right, but a right to education is not. What am I to express if I don't have an education to present the ideas that I want to represent? So there is a lot of problems with the notion that liberalism is the basis of universality of human rights. Universality of human rights, as I argue for it, comes out of what I call overlapping consensus. That is, different civilizations, different cultures come to the same conclusions through their own experiences. When you have that overlapping of cultures and consensus among them, that becomes a human right. It is a right of the human to all human beings by virtue of their humanity and not by virtue of state recognition of the claim. So I think I can defend human rights and universality much better, I believe, than I can defend it by claiming it to be only liberal. I think okay, thank you very much.
Just very quick comments because time is flying. I think number one, a comment related to revivalism and Reformation. The term revivalism is mainly happened in Christianity, as was mentioned. And the problem is, in Arabic, we have one term. We don't have two terms. And people who translate from English to Arabic, they start to call ihya, referring to revivalism, and Reformation. But we have one term which combines both, as Prof. Abdullahi mentioned, which we call tajdeed. This is a classical Islamic term. And there is a very beautiful book for a very well-known scholar from Al-Azhar, Amin al-Kholi, on this concept. But unfortunately, I don't think it's translated into English. It has been written in the 30s on articulating this concept. So it's a bit different, and it combines both the spiritual and the other thing. So this is one quick issue. Another one related to the basics, and we need to refer to basics. I think we need to maybe bridge the two opinions. Definitely, Islam has basics which are clear. Some basics are very clear. The Quran mentioned clear things, which we know in Islam as muhkam. So this is, nobody will argue that you have other pillars than the 5 pillars of Islam. So nobody will argue about the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nobody will argue about the values were mentioned in the Quran or in the Sunnah. So these are things that, of course, we start from them. You cannot start from nowhere. You need to start from. But I think maybe what Prof. Abdullahi was referring to is a classification of sciences which came later. The classification of sciences which came later, and this is of course a human endeavor. But definitely we have things that everybody agrees upon and everybody need to adhere to. Otherwise, the term Islam itself will be questionable. Concerning the issue of ulama, I think this, it's a very big problem in all religions, not only in Islam, whether the alim need to be by the state or not by the state, and this is a very long debate. Even Christianity, the same thing. So the best way, let's go for a practical way instead of talking about the issue itself, because it cannot be resolved. But we need to look into a practical way to resolve this one. The practical way is to have a civil discourse. This is the practical way. So civil discourse, we need to bring everybody on the table, and we need to try to come to a kind of consensus agreement. Then things will go forward. But if we try to argue about whether this is better or this is not, this is an academic discussion that will never end, and it will continue forever. But to bring everybody on the table, this will be the practical way. The last point is actually related to the issue of human rights. I think Prof. Abdullahi he's of course better than me, much more better than me in this area. But I would like to comment on one issue, and maybe this person, if we can bring him later. I don't know if somebody knows Professor Said Hussein Nasr. He's a very well-known scholar in the United States. Said Hussein Nasr has a comment which is very interesting comment. He said, unfortunately, in the late time of the Western civilization, there was some social experiments, and it's unfair to try to enforce the social experiments on traditions that have been for 2,000 years, 3,000 years, and these social experiments, we don't know what will be the outcome yet. We are talking about many ideas which are under experimentation socially up till now. 70 years back, 100 years back, but it's still under experimentation. While we have traditions which are all of them at least back for 1,500 years ago. And these traditions have been working and holding the society for a long time. So we need to differentiate between what works and what will not work, and then we people need to come to a kind of a more proper understanding of this one. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Prof and Prof for the Fekry as well. And thank you for everyone for attending this forum. And I think before closing the session, I would like to invite Dr. Naima to give his last few words. And just for your knowledge, for those who who did not manage to get this book, it is available outside at $50 today at discounted price. Dr. Naima, please.
Gentlemen, again to represent the organizers of this session today, IRF and G25, it is my duty to thank all of you to have made time to come here today. It's very, very encouraging to see a large group of people wanting to gain more knowledge. And also I would like to thank, although our guest of honor has left us, I would like to record here our sincere thanks to Yang Berhormat the Syahri Sunggip for having for having launched the book today. And of course, Faruq, I must thank you for moderating the session, and the two esteemed wise speakers. I really, really must thank Prof. Naim and Prof. Fekry, Waleed Fekry. We really have learned so much from you. As the last part of my pleasant duty before we do our breaking of fast, may I call upon Datuk Dr. Nur Farida to represent G25 as a partner with IRF to give a token of appreciation to our two speakers. Is of course the book that got launched. Or is it the English version or the Malay version?
The Malay version. The Malay version. Prof. You can take.
Yeah, Prof. Naim is getting he's getting the book that he wrote, only it's been translated.
Your library.
Thank you. And if either of you need a translator when you read that, I'm available. Just call me. I'll come and translate it for you. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Banyak-banyak terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.